No, I mean, this has to be on. You can. Everyone, headsets, please. Thank you. We're just waiting for a welcome address from Mr. Minister, and he's on his way. It'll be about 30 seconds more, so please bear with us. We will start exactly in a minute, if that's okay. Sorry about this. We just had a bit of a delay on this. Thank you.
Where do I sit? Okay, thank you. Good morning.
Thank you, everyone. And please, can you confirm if you can hear me? I see a few thumbs up, but then I don't see everybody's thumbs up. Okay, good. I think you can. You might have to switch it on. Thank you, everyone here, and thank you for waiting. It's a packed, full house. It's a small house, but it's a packed house, which is amazing to see. We're talking about something very, very important, thing that really impacts every country in the world. Actually, I was going to say a lot of countries, but I do think everybody who lives on this planet has an impact on what we are talking about today. So we will be talking about methane, and methane is one of the most potent greenhouse gases, as well as a short-lived pollutant, which affects us all. So here we will have different conversations about, from academics, from research institutes, from financing institutions, from a whole sort of certification bodies, all of it, to actually talk about the entire ecosystem of food-based emissions. And it could be a lot of different kinds. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Mr. Max Fontaine. He is the Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development, Republic of Madagascar, who has graced us in this. Is a very busy person, but thank you for making it here. I would like to request you to at least start off the session with a welcome address and at least tell us from your perspective how important this is for you and for your region. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. It's already 1 p.m. It's an honor to be here again at the FAO pavilion to do this opening remarks. 2 weeks ago, we were in Cali for the Biodiversity Cup, and I already had to do the opening remarks for an FAO event on how can we foster biodiversity positive agriculture for countries such as Madagascar. And to give you a brief context, yesterday evening, 4 countries in the world gathered to create a new coalition. You might have heard about it. So this new coalition is called the G0. What does the G0 mean? G0 is for the last 4 countries in the world that are carbon negative. So Madagascar, Bhutan, Panama, and Suriname are all carbon negative, and the only criteria to join this coalition is to sequester more carbon than you emit. So our countries are already solutions to the fight against climate change because our forests sequester the carbon that is emitted by other countries. And I think that if all the countries had the same situation, we wouldn't be gathering here every year, COPs, soon the 30th COP, and still trying to find solutions. So I don't want to say that we don't need to make efforts, not at all, because we are already in the best situation. But even though we are carbon negative country and nature positive country, this is something really important. We are carbon negative, but nature positive, biodiversity positive. And most of the countries in the G0 are mega diverse countries. But what is really unfair is that even if we are already solution countries, we do a lot of efforts to transform our agricultural systems. And I think it's unfair, but still we do it because we believe in it, because we think it's the only way, only sustainable way to, for the long term, that will be adapted to the effect of the climate change. So what is sustainable agriculture? What is sustainable food producing? It's agricultural systems that are that produce less emissions of methane, of carbon, and that respect more biodiversity. So agroforestry systems, regenerative agriculture, and Madagascar was one of the first countries to work with the FAO on changing these products with the smallholder farmers near the protected areas. We have an holistic approach in these new systems. So I feel like we are only in the beginning of these reflections because we might have been talking about these solutions of transforming the agriculture to produce less methane, less carbon, but only few concrete projects have been implemented on the ground. And I hope that these talks that we have together between governments, between FAO, between private sector, will bring concrete projects on the ground, because we don't have much time left. Our soil are being so poor, actually. So if we do not change our producing systems, we will regret it not in 50 years, but already today, in 5 years, you can already see the concrete results of new practices, of integrated planting, farming methods, also socially responsible, environmentally responsible. And I wish all of you a really fruitful session. Really looking forward also to hear from the specialists, from everyone's perspectives. And thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Fontaine, for your kind remarks. I think he's laid it out, I think, about the time, and there are not many implemented projects out there. And I think that's something we want to talk about today. The science is very clear, but that's not enough. After the science is clear, then what? So I think we need to get to what we want to do and how we will, A, get this transition at scale, because little drops in the ocean, I know, are great, but we need those drops to be much bigger now. And secondly, we really need to get finance into the system to reduce the risk of reversal as well on a lot of these transitions that we keep talking about. With that, thank you so much, and really, really appreciate you coming here, Mr. Fontaine. So the run of this event is as follows. We will have a couple of presentations at the beginning to set some context. Now, when we say the science is clear, we also want to talk about how clear is the science. And so we will have our first presentation on the science of it and all of the different kinds of data and metrics that have been found out within these three sectors, that's rice, dairy, and beef. And number two, we will then have a presentation on specific to rice, just as a case study on how that can be also looked at scale. The idea is to showcase implemented successful projects that then can be replicated across the world. I think we all need to do that, because I think we spend too much time doing all the things on our own and earning accolades for it, but that's not enough for the problem that we have today. So I think our big takeaway from this entire thing is, guys, there are potential solutions, there are potential science. Let's not keep doing the same thing again and again. We don't have that much time. Okay, so with that, if you may allow, I would invite Mr. Bjorn, and I will, your second name, Bjorn Ole, I gave it a bit short, who's the senior scientist with IRI, which is the International Rice and Research Institute. It's a very prestigious institute for who do not know, but for rice, this is an important research body. And so Ole is the climate change focal point for IRI, and he has been working for a long time on GHG emissions on rice. So we really want to hear from him, and he can go on and on about the science. Okay, so please feel free to ask about questions, anything to do with science. Here we are talking about two themes: the science and what do you do after the science. So please feel free to think about it and frame your questions and whatever you may need to clarify before we get out of this room. So I'll leave it to you, Bjorn. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, Sandeep. We had a little bit of last-minute changes, so there's one piece of information which I think is important, which is not on my slides, and that's an overview of agricultural emissions. So the three agricultural subsectors are livestock, rice, and other soils. Other soils are nitrous oxide emissions, mostly from fertilizer. And of course, livestock globally has the highest emissions by far, rice the lowest. If we look at the mitigation potential, at least the economically feasible mitigation potential at the moment, it's much higher in rice as compared to livestock. So what can be mitigated at the moment in rice and livestock is roughly the same amounts. And when you look into rice-producing countries, rice is a very important factor in terms of national greenhouse gas budgets. In Vietnam, for example, 15% of all national emissions come from rice. That's more than the transport sector in Vietnam. So also the mitigation potential, of course, in ASEAN, for example, alone is estimated at 50 million tons of CO2 equivalents annually. So from rice. So there's a lot of potential there. I want to start explaining that potential with an overview of various options that we have in rice production to reduce emissions. And they are really distributed across the cultivation cycle. It starts with proper leveling of the field, which enables water management, which also reduces fertilizer use and seed use, choosing the right variety. Varieties with a shorter duration obviously have lower emissions. Direct seeded rice can reduce emissions. Fertilizer deplacement or coated urea has potential to reduce emissions. And then AWD, so alternate wetting and drying, and different water management. I think that's very well known by now, has a very high mitigation potential. And then the second biggest factor is residue management, so straw management. The more straw is incorporated in the field, the higher the methane emissions. But there are options to valorize the straw to make it a product for farmers that they can earn additional profit from, and with that we can reduce incorporation into the soil, reduce methane emissions, for example, mushroom production, compost production, but also these decomposable bioplastics that are made from rice straw pulp. So there are different options. Altogether, the economic mitigation potential is estimated at 36%. But when we look into different studies, and when we look in combinations of all of this, and also looking into what's maybe not economically feasible right now, we can easily double that. So I think 70% is definitely a goal we should have over the next 10 years. So alternate wetting and drying, I think, will be a big part of the discussion, also probably in the case studies. It is the only practice that currently enables carbon markets, that where people can earn carbon credits from. There are different methodologies available. At the moment, it's gold standards methodology. Vera, we just heard in a session earlier, will bring out a new methodology by the end of this year or early next year. And the methodologies are both improved compared to an old one that also many of you will know has been inactivated last year. And these methodologies, the gold standard methodology, is currently being adapted for the joint crediting mechanism of Japan, the JCM, and which just launched the first methodology for the Philippines, and we're currently working on the next one for Vietnam. Also, I want to highlight a web page. It's called the Rice Sustainability Hub of Gold Standard. There's lots of information around carbon credits, carbon credit projects, also connections to credit buyers. So it's called Sustainability Hub, Rice Sustainability Hub of Gold Standard. The big question is, of course, what do farmers do in their fields? And it's something that we need to answer, not only to implement properly carbon credit projects, but also to get better greenhouse gas estimates, better greenhouse gas inventories, and NDC targets, so better goals for the NDC targets and better tracking of NDC targets. And I want to just explain two approaches that we've developed to support this monitoring of rice emissions. And they are both, they can be used in terms of carbon credits and carbon markets, but also they are much broader and will help governments get better data. One is here a tool that we've developed in Vietnam. You see here the Mekong Delta, and this tool is not primarily a rice emission tool. We asked the Department of Crop Production in the Ministry of Agriculture, what do you actually need? And they said, we want to know early on what will be our rice harvest at the end of the season. How much rice do we get? We need to know that early on. And you can imagine there's a lot of a big system being implemented, lots of people involved in getting that data to the ministry. Vietnam has a digitalization strategy, and we said, okay, we can help you build a tool to digitize that, to get the information faster, to aggregate it on different levels, and so you have earlier estimate of your rice harvest at the end of the season. The only thing that we ask when we do this is two pieces of information, and that is what is the water management in your area and what's the residue management practice in your area. And so with providing this improved system for rice yield prediction, we also then get now information on water management and straw management in the national statistics of Vietnam. And that is information that's absolutely crucial to estimate emission, and that is not available in any country. And we have now requests from other countries that also want to adopt this system. We then say, okay, let's use that information not in isolation, but put it in a whole system. Attach a greenhouse gas calculator to it. With all that activity that comes in, we can put it immediately into a greenhouse gas calculator and get estimations of emissions over the Mekong Delta, for example. Let's put verification protocols in place so that it can be used for proper tier 3 reporting. And what we're working on now is looking at the power of satellites, and that's how can we use satellite information to see what's the water management in the field. Now you would say, it's easy, you see that there's water or not, but at some point the canopy is closed and then we can't see the soil anymore. So that has been a big problem to estimate whether a field is continuously flooded or if it has an alternate wetting and drying practice. And what we've done now is looking at different data from satellites. Here's an example from an ALOS-2 image from the JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency. And you can see here on the left-hand side the Google Maps image, and you see in the middle of the picture there's a pond. And you see the pattern on the JAXA picture. It's black, so we can clearly see that's a water layer. That's a flooded water layer. In the bottom right, you see bare soil. It's not rice, it's a different crop that's being produced, and you see the pattern is very different, and we can see, okay, that is dry soil. And then on the top left, you see lots of rice. Canopy is closed. You cannot really see what's happening underneath, and we put water level sensors in place. And you see the red areas, they are where our water level sensors show it's flooded. There's standing water in the field. So that's a canopy with flooded soil. And the other patterns, this is more violet here in that picture, this is where our water level sensors say it's dry. So we can now have different estimations of flooded fields and dry fields even when the canopy is closed. We're putting this into a better model, and then we can automatically estimate emissions over a large area. This is the science I wanted to start off with. That was my last slide, and I hand back to Sandeep. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll give you the context. Yeah, okay. Thank you, Björn. It was interesting. So please, we will have a lot of time for questions. In fact, we'll have more time for questions because we have one less panelist. So we have at least a few more minutes to think about it, and please firm up of what thoughts you have. The next presentation, this will be from my colleague Kasturi from VNV. On this exact thing, the whole theme of this event is there is a science, we know the science, and how can science and project implementation work together to then achieve scale. And then at the panel, we'll also get to how to finance that scale. So that's the whole part that we are talking about here. So Kasturi, just as an introduction, heads partnerships for VNV. A lot of her work goes on-ground scale-up of projects and who are the implementing community organizations on the ground who can deliver those projects. So I will leave it to you, Kasturi, and you have about 5 to 6 minutes, if you don't mind. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Sandeep, for the introduction. I think coming from a very strong scientific presentation, which sets the foundation for us, the next question that we really need to ask is how do we do it? What are the implementing actionable solutions on ground? This is why VNV, Value Network Ventures, and a lot of project developers like markets. So a little introduction to VNV very quickly. VNV stands for Value Network Ventures. We're a project developer in the Global South across 18 countries, and we're working with about 5 million smallholder farmers. A predominant part of that work is nature-based solutions and sustainable rice cultivation. So why is VNV for markets? Markets, if leveraged in a transparent and traceable manner, can accelerate climate action, especially for rice-producing groups, by 10x maybe in developing economies and LDCs. Markets, if used in a responsible manner, can directly help towards adaptation efforts, building resilience with these rice-producing groups, not only for food and nutritional security, but for fair trade, access to market linkages, access to premium pricing as well. These are some of the themes, and on that segue of access to premium pricing, a lot of the traditional buy side does not support premium pricing, and this is where carbon markets can actually fill that gap by providing incentives to the farmers and reducing the risk of reversal. There's always criticism with the carbon markets that comes our way, that it may be a license to pollute, or there are a lot of gaps that aren't filled yet. But our counter question to that is, if not this, then what? Should we just not do anything? And that's why carbon markets for us are important in this play as well. Access to working capital is practically non-existent for farmer collectives right now. And the incentive of premium pricing and all of these benefits can actually help them with the continuation of those processes, therefore adding to permanence, right? So VNV works, and a lot of project developers, such as ourselves, works with various blended instruments, such as we work with various blended instruments such as shared resources, subsidies on warehousing, crop insurance, and others. And VNV has spent years actually understanding these complexities on the ground, right? Understanding farmer challenges and working with these farmers very closely and collaboratively for knowledge sharing and an information exchange to understand what the challenges are and how we can learn from them and deploy solutions on ground. So I'd like to take you through 4 case studies really quickly, which shows actually the federation of these farmer collectives on the ground. These are all in the Global South and all living and live projects that demonstrate AWD or sustainable rice cultivation on the ground. The first one being scaling financial inclusion, where creditworthiness of farmers and financial inclusion and education is a main theme. This one is in India. So we started with a pilot where there were about only 250 farmer groups that were included over an area of about 16,000 hectares. But there was a massive uptake and a scale up to about 170,000 farmer collectives over 250,000 hectares, where 3,300 farmer groups were bank accounts were created for 3,300 farmer groups. So this is just an example of the impact that we can create at scale. Farming for the future, this is Nepal, which some of the challenges are technological innovations as well as financial education that we are addressing through project development. Sustainable rice cultivation in Bangladesh, one of our larger project portfolios, apart from India, which is about 400,000 hectares with farmer collectives. And Laos. So this one is particularly interesting because VNV as a project developer, we are all about the bottom-up participatory approach. But with this case study, we actually realized that the top-down approach with governments is also very important, and how policy and regulatory frameworks can actually help incentivizing these farmers to continue the practice on ground. Here we're working with one of the forefront political parties in Laos, as well as the Ministry of Agriculture and Forests, to implement this project over 20,000 hectares. It is a project that we're taking forward from World Bank with NAFRI, or the National Agricultural and Forestry Research Institute, and it actually begs the question, what after that program, right? How do we take that forward? How do we reduce the risk of reversal? So we're working very closely with NAFRI and the government as well to implement this program on ground. This is a little snapshot of our MOUs, agreements and letters of intent with some of the governments that support and engage the farmer groups. Moving on to something that Bjorn was speaking about as well. One of the most crucial aspects of a sustainable rice cultivation program is how to monitor it, how to document it, and how to report it in a traceable manner, which actually also aids in investor security when they come in, right? So we have co-developed a traceability app called TraceX, which actually onboards farmers from across the different countries, and through the use of a simple smartphone can upload land ownership documents, can upload the yield and the harvest rates, etc. And this is an open data platform to policymakers, to implementers, as well as to the investors, which can actually help with resilience building, disaster relief, exactly what Bjorn was talking about as well, where we're piloting satellite technology for the detection of flooding and drying. Wrapping up my presentation, because I know I don't have too much time, with challenges and our field insights, because no project comes without challenges, as much as we'd like them to. But it's really important for us to map these complexities and address them on a custom basis in each geography and each landscape with the farmer collectives. These are some of our field insights as we progress, and this of course ties back to all 4 of the case studies showcased so far, in knowing that markets, and especially carbon markets, should have a social narrative included as well. While we talk about an ROI, we should also consider the social cost of carbon, or an SROI, a social return on investment, which will help these farmer groups stay in the programs and develop this on a large scale and a long term. On to my last slide. So we're often asked if this works. We have the science, we have the solutions in theory, but does this work? So this is one of our programs which is live right now. We've just successfully validated and registered this program under gold standard. And we're expecting a pipeline of about 7 to 8 programs from the different countries that I had mentioned earlier to follow through as well. I think this is not only us, there are a lot of other players in the markets as well that have demonstratively shown that this does in fact work, and that they are ready to engage. There is a method-based technology and tool that can help this. So wrapping up, if used responsibly, markets should be designed for long-term adaptation. Should be by the farmers, for the farmers, and collectively with the farmers, who are the backbone of several developing economies. So with that, handing it over to Sandeep to moderate a distinguished panel and dive deeper into these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the intent was to also show how it works, because I think otherwise we are in our little bubbles of pilots and we never really know what to do beyond that. And for me, I think the big theme when this session was being co-created as well, we always thought that how can we showcase what different activities are there, the power of collectives. We're a big believer in that. We think that's the way the world should move in the future as well. So thank you, Kasturi, for putting all of that in picture. Before we start the panel, and I know Mr. Minister has a very tight schedule, I would like to invite the Minister, and this is a little bit out of the run of the show here, guys, sorry, but then I know he's going to leave in the middle of the panel, so that's with his time schedule. I think I would like to give him some comments, what you have seen so far with the science and the implementation, on what do you think countries like Madagascar, or in general, countries in Africa and Asia have very similar rice growing, A, potential, and B, the potential to also transition. If you have some comments on that, Mr. Minister, since you sat through our presentations, I'm really appreciative of that as well. So,
thank you. I won't be long, and thank you for the presentation. Just to add to the context, in Madagascar, and I don't know how it is in your country, but we eat rice for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And I was talking about, the G0 initiative, where we need to keep that status. We need to mitigate the rise of our carbon emissions. So if we do not improve our rice production, if we do not mitigate the impact of our rice production, it's almost sure that one day or another, and I think it will be soon, we will leave the G0 coalition. We will become a carbon emitter, And I don't want to be in charge when my country would make the step of leaving the carbon negative to join the carbon emitters. So we really need to make our rice production evolve in terms of methane and in terms of carbon. But to do that, we need strategic shift. We need legal framework reforms, as we've talked about. But mostly, we need money. We need funding. We need finance. And in our NDC, in our 10-year plan until 2030, Madagascar needs $24 billion to achieve this target. And actually, we are not. Funding is so huge that we need alternative mechanism to finance that transition. And it's not to the farmers in Madagascar to pay that cost. It's not to the farmers who produce the food to others, but struggle to bring food over the table to finance and to invest and to bear the burden of the new methodologies. So that is why the Malagasy government is actually undergoing a lot of reforms and deep reforms and courageous reforms and ambitious reforms to incentivize the private sectors, the carbon market, to invest in Madagascar. So if your organization wants to join this effort, I know the IRA, I just learned it, has already an office in Madagascar, but I hope we can strengthen our partnership or collaboration. And if your organization wants also to join this effort, please, I'm sorry I need to leave now, but you can have my contact with VNV's team. It would be really an honor to collaborate with you and to welcome you in Madagascar. Thank you very much.
Thank you. He's one of the youngest environment ministers in the world, I think. He's just 28 years old, just to give you a background. But this is what we need. I think we need a shift on how we think and how we do things, because otherwise we keep talking and talking. And I've been attending COPs for a very, very long time, trust me. And, we keep talking about the same things again and again, and that annoys a lot of us. So with that, I think now we can have a deep dive into more of this, of how to get this done and what are we looking for here. So we have a very esteemed panel and we're going to take some of your time to actually talk about a lot of this. I know we spent a lot of time on rice, but then listen, there is a lot more out there in terms of methane emissions and what goes on with this sector. So we have dairy and the meat industry as well. So we really need to talk about all of them because they don't exist in isolation. Livestock and cropping is a thing that exists together. So what we do with a person is very important. So let's not take this down just to a farmer level. A farmer will also have livestock. A farmer will also have a lot of other things, which all ties into regenerative ag, to actually methane emissions from enteric and a lot of other things. So here I would like to invite all of you. You know who you are, I think. So I think our seating is that Yvonne here, Marion there, and then, yeah, that's what we were. Yes, so, I mean, first of all, to just introduce the panel. I know I called all of them together, but they're quite esteemed people, and all of them are Googleable, by the way. So you can just look at them as well. But Yvonne Pinto is the Director General of IRI. As you know, International Rice Research Institute, it does a lot of work around rice and methane, among other things. Then we have Marion Verles. She is the CEO of SustainCert. SustainCert is a leading certification body. And why is she here? I think she's just launched an amazing initiative, in my personal opinion, Marion, and congratulations to that, called the Value Chain Initiative, which is a collective of a lot of private sector players as well as scientific bodies and research and carbon standards, etc. I wouldn't say carbon standards, let's just say standards, to work with value chain mitigation. And I think that's a very, very important concept. Without private sector involvement, we will never solve this problem. And that is where I think Marion comes in as well. And then we have Donald. And Donald is with the Global Dairy. Donald, give me a sec. I have a technology issue right now. So just give me a second. Sorry about this. It was Global Dairy Platform. I just want to get the name right, Donald. Oh, it's written over there. Okay. So he's the executive director. So again, you're talking about people who do a lot of work around there. And we have the senior leadership right here of these amazing organizations who are here to, I wouldn't say who are here to solve this problem, at least think and talk about at least trying to get, okay. Thank you. I love this organizing team. They have everything sorted out. So, okay, so basically, I would, start with, okay, and now because we have a little shift in the panelists, so you will let's expect a shift in the exact sequence of questions as well. So I will go like this, if you don't mind. Is that okay? I think is that okay? Perfect. Given Yvonne, to you, yeah. So given the question of rice and methane, and IRRI has been doing a lot of work. I am aware of a lot of work that IRRI has been doing in methane abatement, not just from the science perspective, but also from the perspective of countries and how you work with different countries. I think it's a very important question or a solution, because sometimes we are caught up in just the science of it and publications, and then what? And you do engage with a lot of governments, which I find quite interesting. So would you want to throw some more light on the whole rise mitigation and your interventions policy level as well?
Sandeep, thank you. Can you hear me? Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I want to slightly rephrase your question, because mitigation is not the only thing that IRRI does. And so I wanted to just paint a slightly different picture for you. When we think about rice production, we think about production and we think about the environmental consequences. We don't often think about the genetics behind the production. And so adaptation is a very key element of some of the contribution that we make. And in fact, it's very difficult to quantify that contribution in the current policy discussions, which are very much about total factor productivity and the environmental consequences. And so a reform is necessary to try and understand how much can genetic innovation and our investment in genetic innovation actually contribute to a much more effective model. I want to just highlight for you 3 or 4 examples. So IRRI's core work is its breeding programs. Those are very much co-created priorities with government, and we're looking at aspects related to flooding, drought, salinity, submergence, and we're looking at traits in those contexts and how those genetic innovations can stack together to provide propositions in very varying climates, which might include drought and flooding at the same time in the growing cycle. At the same time, we can fast track the development of rice varieties, which usually take about 7 to 8 years. And through sort of phenotypic screening capabilities, which is what we're very well known for, we have, for example, developed 97 elite genotypes for submergence alone. That means that they survive 21 days underwater, surpassing the benchmark of 14 days. We've also developed a technology that has speed-bred varieties. So whereas it would normally take 7 years, it can take 2 years. So given the frequency of climatic shocks and weather events, extreme weather events, we have a toolkit that is primed to be able to deal with that. Furthermore, we have access to the biggest gene bank in the world. And within that technology lies opportunities to use traits to overcome extreme weather events and things like pest and disease incidences and so on at the same time. we're using artificial intelligence to mine that gene bank. And just to give you a brief statistic, in the last year we have been able to screen 60,000 accessions out of a gene bank of 123,000. And just consider it took us 54 years before that to screen just 20,000. So that is the contribution in relation to adaptation. Complement that with mitigation. Clearly, I wanted to talk to you about a project on the ground. So I'm going to go back to Ole's point about the Mekong Delta. It's home to 3.9 million hectares of rice production, accounting for 56% or almost 24.5 million tons of the country's production in Vietnam, which is currently the third largest rice exporter in the world. Average yields are about 6.2 tons per hectare. And in this particular situation, we're talking about 1 million hectares of continuous cultivation, 3 rice cycles a year, short duration varieties. In this particular region, there are problems. They use traditional broadcasting, they use high inputs, they use pests and fertilizer applications that are quite high. What we've been able to do by using agronomic practices is introduce technologies such as alternative wet and drying, which reduces the amount of water usage by up to 35%, and also direct seeding, which Ole mentioned, which reduces the amount of seed required by 50%, reduces the fertilizer requirements by 20%, and in context reduces the methane emissions by somewhere between 40 and 60%. And in addition to that, there are opportunities to look at different districts and demonstrate with farmers in co-creative modes the impact of this work. So this low carbon approach is also producing yield increases of between 3 and 13% in the 5 different districts that are growing demonstrations of up to 50,000 hectares. That's a significant impact. The Vietnamese government is involved in carbon credits in the mix, and so it is also looking at the incentives for farmers for sustainability. And in that context, we're also looking at waste repurposing prospects as part of circular economy, which add a significant amount to farmers' incomes as well. I'm not going to say too much about the monitoring, verification, and reporting systems because Ole did. And I think we have tremendous opportunities to look at how those can be applied. But I want to emphasize, and I'm going to say it twice, not at a field or a plot level, but at a landscape level. If we are going to get serious about mitigation, we have to ensure we can demonstrate it at a level of scale that reduces the impact of these climatic events. That's a massive challenge for all of us, and we must work with others and yourselves to be able to deliver that. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Yvonne. I have a lot of questions. You have a lot of clapping to do, I think. So we will get there. Over to you, Marion. I mean, and I agree with you on the landscape level. I couldn't agree more. I think that's why I keep hopping on scale. Because without that, you're not really having too much of a landscape level approach. And I think the leakage risks also involve. Anyway, we can go on and on about that. I can go on and on about that. But thank you for that, Yvonne. And I really like the pilot that you talked about for the Mekong. And I think there's a lot to learn from there. And that's a part of this conversation as well. What do we learn from each other? But Marion, on the whole idea of, and I think Kasturi's presentation touched on this as well, we don't see the product getting any premium if the farmer does transition. And that for us, I mean, as in VNV, we've seen hundreds and thousands of farmers just saying, guys, this just doesn't work. I mean, I would rather just do what I was doing because my input costs are higher, but my price is just the same. And whenever we speak to companies, we're like, yeah, but it's a trading commodity play, so really let's not go there. I mean, but let's not go there is not going to solve this problem, you know. And I think you've gone there with that discussion, right? And I think that's something to really talk about. So would you like to shed some light on the value chain initiative that you've been working on? What was the genesis of it? And what's the outcome that you expect out of something like this, you know?
Thanks, Sandeep, and very happy to talk about that. Before I do so, just a brief word of thank for Sandeep and Kasturi for bringing us back to transformation happening on the ground. I really enjoy watching the pictures of all the work you're doing and looking at the numbers, like the scale that you're acting at. Coming to Baku, I had mixed feelings. You all know the environment in which we operate, right? I don't have to talk about it again. And I was like, is it just going to be another COP? Why are you going there? And looking at progress happening on the ground and looking at those programs scale and the work that VNV is doing is giving me like the strength and the hope to continue, because that's what we all want to see. That's why we're all sort of getting up from bed every morning so that those programs can happen. And as you said, for those programs to happen, we need money to flow to those programs. So how do we do that? At SustainCert, our job is to be a verifier. So we're a climate impact verifier. And we do that with digital solutions. We started working on value chain climate impact verification back in 2017, 2018. So it's a number of years. And the first partners that came to us were the brands. Danone, a famous French dairy company, Mars, and others that came to me and were telling me, Marianne, we need to decarbonize our Scope 3 emissions. Most of our Scope 3 emissions are coming from our food and agriculture purchases. It's the milk we buy, it's the cereals we buy, the sugar, the coffee, the cocoa. And they were like, should we do carbon offset projects and then take those carbon credits and claim that we're reducing our Scope 3 emissions, or is there a better way to do it? And that was the genesis of what is now called the Value Change Initiative, where we work with food and ag companies, standard setter, and project implementers to really organize the scaling of finance into those programs. So how does it work? It starts with a company that has a commitment to reduce their emissions. Commitment is usually governed by the Science Based Target Initiative. So there's over 1,500 companies that are pledging net zero or science-based target, and they have to have a Scope 3 commitment. Many of them are food companies. And so as soon as you talk about Scope 3 indirect emissions, it means driving action in value chain to reduce emissions. And so what happens is that those companies, the brands, can decide to work with the producers, the traders, and everyone involved in the chain to finance action on farm, transform rice production. And the beauty of Scope 3, that is very different than an offset, is that if you achieve a reduction on the ground where rice is being cultivated, everyone that is touching the rice downstream, from the farmer down to the consumer, including the retailer, the brand, everyone can claim the same reduction because everyone is part of that chain. And if everyone can claim to be trading, transforming, selling, branding low carbon rice, it means that everyone can also finance that low carbon rice. And all of a sudden, the model is completely different than a carbon offset model, where one person is claiming and therefore only one person can finance that ton. You have a model where everyone in the chain can claim, and you break down the cost by the number of organizations that claim that impact. And so that is absolutely transformative, because scaling that approach means that all of a sudden the cost becomes a lot more manageable for everyone. And so that's what we've been working on. Beyond the complexity associated with quantifying impact on the ground, and it's amazing to see ERI working with Gold Standard to develop methodologies, because we need those methodologies to have a really good handle on how do we reduce emissions. You also need to take into account the complexity of what can everyone claim. If I'm, let's say, Mars, buying rice for pet food, then there are some rules that I need to follow in order to be able to report a lower carbon rise. And so you also have to take into account the corporate inventory reporting standard side of things, which adds complexity. But the benefit is really this ability to co-claim and therefore cost share the mitigation potential. Where we are right now, and back to Sandeep's question, so are we going to see premium prices for low carbon rice? Are we going to see premium prices for low carbon milk or low carbon dairy products? It's going to be very, very hard to see a brand or someone come on stage and say, yes, I'm going to pay more. But in reality, the carbon intensity of agriculture commodities is being priced. It is being priced more and more. If you speak to large food and agriculture companies that have ambitious Scope 3 targets, the timing to meet their first commitment is 2030. There's 5 harvests left, right? 5 growing cycles left. And that means changing their sourcing practices and directing their procurement efforts towards lower carbon commodities. And so that will drive, or should drive, inflection in prices. What we are also seeing is a number of players in the chain taking an active position in saying, I am going to go through a verification process so that I can have independent third-party confirmation that my agriculture commodities are lower carbon than the benchmark. And this is independently verified. So it's not me saying I'm better. It's someone else like Sustainset confirming that. And we are seeing commercial deals happening on the back of the evidence that low carbon commodities are being exchanged between parties. So this is not mainstream yet, but those are signals that the carbon intensity of an agriculture commodity is being priced, and we need collectively to accelerate that transformation, because this is the solution we need to accelerate the work on the ground and give producers, farmers, the signals, the economic signals, to continue on their journey. The other piece of evidence I'd like to use, and then we can come back to that if you have questions, but if you look at the European Union work that is going on, there is a piece of legislation that is being produced in the EU around carbon farming and accelerating low carbon agriculture practices and removals in the agriculture cycle. And what's really interesting is that the way the European Union is framing those requirements to be able to issue a claim that you are sourcing a low carbon commodity or that you're sequestering carbon is more flexible than what you would expect in carbon offset market. Because in carbon offset market, you need to prove additionality, therefore that farmers were not adopting the practice, that you are transitioning farmer from high carbon to lower carbon farming. But the EU has taken a stand and said, we want to recognize our early adopters. There are farmers in the EU that have been doing the right thing for a number of years because they believe in it. We should not exclude them from carbon finance just because they were the first ones. We should recognize them. And so the methodology allows to recognize those farmers that have been taking early action, which means that if you are a corporate sourcing from the EU from an early adopter farmer, with the approach that we've developed, we can verify that those are early adopter farmers, that they are producing lower carbon goods, and that therefore the emission factor that you will report as a brand or as a retailer will be lower. So there are mechanisms beyond carbon offsetting, like value chain financing, that reward early adopter and unlock collective action by making it possible for several players in the chain to cost share and co-claim impacts. And I think that's the direction of travel. We know carbon offsetting as a market is limited. The market of food and agriculture commodity trading is a lot bigger than the voluntary carbon market. And I believe that if we can tap into that, to direct finance to those programs, we will have moved the needle.
Thank you, Marion. I'm really, I mean, I'll come back to you on who are some of the players, because I think it's important to actually understand the enormity of what's being done. Because we were forever in a market on an offset. I think it's time to move the little needle on decarbonization and how we can achieve that. But anyway, now we've spoken enough about rice, and I was going to say food, but we're back to food actually. So here we are with Donald. And Donald, I mean, I know I was like very brief on the introductions, but there's something that really struck me about Donald. I was reading his thing again. He was the past chairman of the International Agri-Food Network, which is quite a big network, and the private sector mechanism, and the UN on the UN Committee on Food Security, World Food Security. These are things that are quite important in our discussion as well. And we want to now move the needle, Donald, to the dairy, livestock, beef sector. So what does your platform do? What got you guys in this? I know it's a very important thing to speak about, but your story on this, please, Donald.
Thank you very much. Everyone hear me okay? Great. I am not going to answer the questions I've just been asked. I thought I'd take a leaf out of Yvonne's book because she started down a different route, and I thought that was really good. So let me tell you a little bit about the global dairy sector. For those of you, hands up if you know much about dairy. Oh, good. One or two of you in the audience. The dairy sector is the world's largest agricultural commodity by value and third largest by volume. There are around 133 million dairy farms in the world. And the average size of that dairy farm, if you would like to hazard a guess, is just under 3 cows, 2.9 cows. Now, I'm not exactly sure what 0.9 of a cow looks like, which end they cut off, but the average is just under 3 cows. Farms in the world with more than 100 cows account for less than 1% of all the dairy farms in the world. So this is an industry with a very, very long tail of smallholder farmers all over the world. It's the first thing I would say. Second thing I would say is on those 133 million farms, 600 million people live. And then if you take into account the jobs created upstream and downstream from that farm, in terms of the livelihoods it supports, there's another 400 million people whose livelihood depend upon the dairy sector. So we're an industry that supports the livelihoods of around 1 billion people in the world. Now, not all of those farms are by any means solely dairy. They are rice farmers, they are other crop producers, etc., but also have dairy as part of their farming practice. And the value of dairy is that it is a daily income source. You milk the cow, you sell the milk on a daily basis, and so you get daily cash flow from it. You're not waiting for crops. Of the 133 million dairy farms in the world, 37 million are solely run by women, which is a really important fact when we start considering the social dimensions we were talking about before. And over 80 million women are employed in the dairy sector full-time around the world. So that's just some social dimensions for dairy before I even mention that 6 million people around the world regularly consume dairy as part of a healthy and nutritious diet. Now, we know in the dairy sector, because FAO, and I'm thrilled to be in FAO's premises today, we have a partnership with them. We know from the research that FAO has done, we know all the good that dairy does from a nutritional perspective, from livelihoods, economic growth, gender empowerment, youth employment, cohesion in rural society. So we know all the good. But we, as a sector, need to recognize that we, like all agricultural commodities, have an impact on the natural environment in which we operate, and therefore we need to be respectful and responsive and do everything we can to reduce the impacts that we're having. And I would love to say that I enjoyed hearing the presentations on rice today, because it's really good to see the work that's going on in that commodity sector, and I wish all other agricultural commodities were as advanced as the rice sector is. So we know all the good we can do. We recognize the challenges we have. Back in 2013, we started a program to measure the environmental and social and economic impact that dairy has in the world. That program is called the Dairy Sustainability Framework, and today we have over 52%, I think it is, of all of dairy, formal dairy in the world reports its progress through this framework, where we track 11 criteria from, as I said, economic to social to environmental outcomes. We know for many years the number one dimension, the number one priority from the members who were reporting through the dairy sustainability frameworks was the greenhouse gas emissions that were going on. That caused us in 2021 to launch a program called Pathways to Dairy Net Zero. And the objective behind that program was to be able to demonstrate in the dairy sector what we can do to reduce our emissions. But let me just pause for a second. While we use the term Pathways to Dairy Net Zero, this program isn't just about reducing emissions. You can't pull one lever and reduce the emissions from the dairy sector if it's going to cause a problem in some other environmental outcome, biodiversity, water quality, wherever else it might be, or if it's going to reduce the nutrition being produced by the dairy sector. Just to throw one more little stat at you for you to take home tonight, 50% of all the calcium that is produced, that goes into our diets in the world, comes from the dairy sector. 50% of our calcium, which is one of the key nutrients that we need for a healthy life. So we've been tracking and reporting on these things. We've launched the Pathways to Dairy Net Zero. We know we need to have a holistic approach. We need to protect livelihoods. We need to protect economic growth, nutritional security, while addressing environmental outcomes. We work very closely with the Global Methane Pledge and with the US State Department, and approached 10 countries around the world to become early adopters of the program, which reminds me, I forgot to tell you one thing. 80% of the emissions from the dairy sector come from emerging markets. Now, when I hear some of the conversation we've had today, it's a little bit focused on the larger players that are operating in the more developed world. I think rice is a little more consolidated than we are in dairy. So we have a challenge in that 80% of our emissions come from emerging markets, not from the developed world. And so we have this program which is looking at two things. What do we do in the developed world? What do we do in those emerging markets? On the emerging markets, we approached through the US State Department 10 countries to become early adopters. 9 of them signed on straight away. We then went to the Green Climate Fund and we said, boy, do we have a deal for you. We have this program that's looking at how do we reduce emissions in the dairy sector globally. We're one of the biggest emitters, as we heard before. I think out of the 40% of anthropogenic methane produced by agriculture, 8% rice, a little over 8% dairy, 14% is from beef. And so you're left with 30% of that 40% coming from 3 commodities, and we're one of them. And we have a plan and a program. Green Climate Fund said, that's great. We don't like global programs. We like regional programs. So we said, that's fine. We split off East Africa. So Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Uganda. Between them, we have a program that is now, in fact, I think at COP20, I lose numbers. What was the one that we had in Egypt? COP27. At COP27, the Green Climate Fund announced early funding for what they call project preparation for this program across those 4 countries. And we have just recently submitted the program for East Africa under IFAD's leadership, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, because to submit to the Green Climate Fund, you have to be what's called an accredited entity. So we're working with IFAD, with FAO, with Bain & Co., ourselves, with ILRI from Africa, and we've put together a plan and a program which is around just under $400 million across those 4 countries. So I thought, we're talking about financing here. So we're raising $400 million, about $100 million a country. And to be honest with you, $100 million will just scratch the surface of the sort of transformation we're talking about in those markets. So one of the components of this program is how do we create a sustaining economic model that will allow us to continue that longer-term transformation. And the secret to that, in our view, is carbon markets in emerging markets, voluntary carbon markets. It's the secret to how we can unlock that longer-term potential. So that's in the developing world. We're also working in Latin America with Costa Rica, Colombia, and Uruguay, a little bit further back, but preparing a concept note to go to the Green Climate Fund. And then more recently, we kicked off in Pakistan. In Latin America, we're working with CAF, the Latin American Development Bank, who I see are here as well. And in Pakistan, we're working with the National Rural Support Program. Again, they're accredited entities to the Green Climate Fund, with the objective of raising around, again, $100 million per country. So that's the work we're doing in the more developing markets. And to the points that were made by the other two speakers, in the developed world, we see quite a different approach. And there it is really about in-value chain activity. We have a number of projects that are in addition to the in-value chain work, and we can talk more about that work that we're doing. But we're also tackling things like feed. We know that by improving animal feed, whether it's supplements to reduce methane, whether it's inhibitors, whether it's improving feed quality, etc., feed has a major impact on reducing emissions in a very short time period. So we're working on feed, we're working on processing, and a number of other things. And I think I probably talked too long, so happy to hand the microphone back to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I think it's important to also recognize, like you said, you're 30% of that entire. I mean, we kind of, and it's a thing even within the value chains and changes that we're looking at. We need to look at this more seriously, I think, in the future as well. We're quite, I wouldn't say fixated on food only, but I mean on agri growing. I think we need to look at dairy. But quickly, before I go to the audience, because we have about 20 minutes or 17 minutes more. So not too long, about a couple of minutes on the policy front. We are at a COP at the end of the day. I mean, we need to, I was going to say we need to realize that, hopefully that realization hit. But from a policy perspective, even first to you, you are a multilateral body in a way because you're operating across different countries and different policy environments. What do you see specific to rice, or feel free to touch upon any of those sectors? What do you see the specific policy interventions that these countries need to really accelerate? And from a personal perspective, reduce the risk of reversal? Because for me, it's always the risk of reversal as well that needs to be taken into account. So I mean, over to you, Yvonne. On this.
So Sandeep, thank you. And they should have warned you that we were a bunch of rebels when they invited you to look to guide us. I got three things that I'd like to say in response to the question that you issued. And one of those touches upon financing and policy. And it really is about co-creating, and it is about unlocking climate finance. And so IRI was very delighted to be here. And I just want to point to my colleague at the back there, Stan Blade, who is the current acting DG of ICRISAT. The CGIAR have a relationship which has just been signed in the last few days with the Asian Development Bank to scale up these interventions. Now that complements an initiative with the African Development Bank and indeed with the World Bank, which is about enabling countries to engage in understanding how they can both scale their technology contributions to things like greenhouse gas emission reduction, but also the policy frameworks required to enable that. That's the first thing I'd like to say, getting climate finance into agriculture for the purpose of mitigation. The second thing is the monitoring verification systems, methodologies and approaches. There's tremendous mileage, and I think, Donald, you said something interesting, which was about the more formalized and the more export-oriented the markets are, the more likely those value chain mechanisms are likely to be applicable and successful. And can we combine my first point with the second, was as we scale up, can we actually look for opportunities to work together in demonstrating those in different geographies, notwithstanding some of the voluntary-based carbon markets. So can we do that? Now here is the real cliffhanger. We've talked a lot about production, we've talked a lot about the environment. You also identified, Marion, the notion of nutrition, and Donald, you too. We're not talking about diets that are solely rice or solely meat-based, or indeed the millets, which my colleague at the back of the room will talk about. We are talking about diversified diets and holistic farming systems. And so when we talk about a social return on the investment related to climate mitigation, we should be talking about practices that are conserving the environment. So we are talking about planetary health, and there's a social return both to human health outcomes but to the planet too. There is nutritious food that we are producing which are directly correlated with human health outcomes. And indeed, we've got complementary to those things factors which are more economic in terms of production and environmental in terms of mitigating climate and adapting our food systems. So when we talk about transformational food systems, that's what we should be talking about. It's not one or two of those things, it's a combination of those things. Thanks, Sandeep.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you for that. Really, it is, and it gives me some food for thought as well, I think, in terms of how we should look at this. So I think it's at some point, Marion, coming to you, I mean, at some point, somebody paying the cost of carbon and decarbonizing scope 3. But it's a lot about food security and adaptation as well for that decreaser, because at the end of the day, low carbon is also good for food security, nutrition, all of that. But anyway, so it's a lot of things that I'm right now thinking about, actually. But to you, and this is the policy theme that we're talking about, from a corporate accounting policy thing, what do you think needs to change or re-looked at, or what can be rejigged, if I may, to make this happen faster? So over to you on that.
Thanks, Sandeep. And so three things I'd like to share on the policy front. I think clearly even though the model I talked about is driven by corporates making voluntary commitments, what is behind those voluntary commitments is two things. First, knowing that regulation around carbon disclosure is coming. It's happening everywhere. So it's preparing for that. And second, it's knowing that taking action now to mitigate your emission as a company is going to be good for your business. And so keeping that momentum around carbon disclosure and reporting is really, really important, because it sends a really strong signal to corporates that you can't get away without reporting. And as soon as you start reporting your emissions, you become scrutinized. And here you have investor pressure, consumer pressure that start kicking in. So I think keeping that policy drive is really, really important. Second, and to the point that Donald mentioned, and you mentioned it, Sandeep, as well, in emerging economies, there is less focus on value chain financing, also because it's less known, and because the domestic infrastructure around carbon markets is less established than in other countries. And so having policies that establish domestic carbon markets is really important, because it will unlock for domestic economies the ability to sell carbon credits, but also the ability to monetize climate impacts in a different way, possibly via value chain pathways and scope 3 reporting. And I agree that this would be primarily for commodities that are being exported. But really having strong domestic market policies, carbon market policies, is really important to accelerate that transition and create the domestic infrastructure that makes it possible for carbon to be priced. Because at the end of the day, we're talking about pricing carbon, whether it's a carbon market mechanism or a scope 3 carbon reporting mechanism. At the end of the day, we're talking about pricing carbon here. And then the last one that I want to mention is agriculture subsidies. Can we align more and more agriculture subsidies with practices that make sense from a climate perspective?
Sticking on the theme of policy. So you want me to talk policy this time? Okay. No problem. I just want to pick up on one comment about emerging markets and the value chains in them. And I should have mentioned the organization that I run the board is the CEOs of 8 of the world's biggest dairy companies. So we're run as a much more commercially oriented organization than maybe some other industry associations or groups. If you are looking to invest in agriculture in Africa, if we just pick Africa, I was there, arrived from Africa yesterday, it is relatively easy to get funding for something like cashews or almonds or coffee, because they are export-oriented value chains, directly to your point, Marion. The challenge with something like the dairy sector is that it is a very local, very domestic value chain. So how do you create export value from it? And that's where we see the potential of carbon markets. I cannot export my milk from Tanzania or from Kenya, but I could export my carbon credit. So, we think it's really, really important. So from a policy perspective, please finish the work on Article 6, get it all agreed, get it cemented in so that we can move forward with some assurance on that. That would be one point I mentioned. Second thing is just in terms of the question around the financing for transformation and the financing for development. We work very closely with the Global Research Alliance, as I know you do in the rice industry. And the Global Research Alliance did some really sort of, top high-level analysis of the potential for reducing emissions in the dairy sector. And they said we can reduce emissions for dairy by 40% if we could just implement good practice on every dairy farm around the world. Now, it doesn't matter whether you're in Denmark, you're in the Netherlands, or you're in Nigeria. If you plotted all of your dairy farms on a normal distribution, you would find farms that are like really at the best of the best in terms of emission potential, even in the United States. And then you will find farms that are actually at the other end. And so there's a lot of work we can do to improve practices. And the fascinating thing about that 40% comes at no cost. In yield more for the transformations that are required. Again, according to the GRA, there's about another 35% emissions we could take out of the dairy value chain if we could implement the technologies that exist today in every farm. Now, that's not practical because some of those technologies cost money and not every farm can necessarily has the scale in order to implement them. But there's 75% potentially of emissions that we know we can take out of the dairy sector today once we can bring the costs of implementation and we can bring the education, training, extension services. So to me, a policy around improved extension services, etc., would be a valuable thing for us to see as well.
Thank you. I think we have about 3 minutes now. Sorry about this, but a quick round of questions. This is like a kind of a lightning round. I have one hand here. There are two there. That's three. That's it, guys. Sorry, but let's go with you first.
Hi. My question is for Yvonne. Thank you for sharing about your work with low carbon rice. It sounds like a fantastic initiative. My question is about how you're approaching your work in the sense of social protections and the low carbon transition, and how you might be balancing how you might be protecting social protections, there we go. And how you might be balancing your need to potentially protect intellectual property with your new technology, but also protecting social protections of farmers as you continue to produce this new technology.
So the topic of the conversation is decarbonizing food value chains, but a lot of the discussion has been on carbon offsetting, which by definition you're selling the rights to those emission reductions outside of the value chain. So it's not a value chain mitigation action. And especially as I first spoke about around jurisdictional level carbon programs, you lose the ability to trace those emissions. So how are we ensuring that double count doesn't start happening through these value chains?
I want to talk about my experience only for 1 minute. Is it possible? Okay. Yes. You hear me? You hear me now? Oh, okay. Well, okay. Really, very important. Fatih, I'm from Yemen. You know the situation in Yemen, hard. I starting with dreams to arriving until 1 million tree of coffee. You talking about the coffee, and I want to give you my experience. I started in 2017 with the city of Geneva. Really, believe me, today I finished 500,000 of plant of coffee to produce in Yemen to help the population. And yes, I want to share with you my experience. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, our lightning round's good. Yvonne, you go first.
Thank you so much for your question. It's rather a difficult question to answer across a range of geographies because the social protection elements are generally deployed by government. and therefore we work in the context of government. So government of Vietnam in the Mekong Delta is actually used an approach through taking loans from development finance institutions to trial a carbon credit offset scheme with their farmers. So these farmers that are involved in the 1 million hectare program are tied into the commitment through the Ministry of Agriculture and their engagement with the government. In relation to your second point, which is about intellectual property, we are a public goods agency. We produce public goods as part of the research contributions to global and humanitarian causes. So our technologies are produced in such a way that not only are they deployable in multiple geographies, but they are free to use, and we provide them through co-creation and deployment that are funded externally, usually by governments or through these concessional loans through development finance institutions. I hope that helps to answer your question. Thank you.
Thank you. And quickly on the offsetting question. So what I was talking about is not offsetting. It's keeping the carbon impacts in the value chain and creating mechanisms that allow the players in the chain to claim the same impact and therefore share the cost, to avoid exactly the case that you mentioned, which is a case where with offsetting, the impact is taken outside the value chain. For example, for an airline to claim to have met their climate goals. And when that happens, technically, everyone in the chain cannot claim that impact anymore. So you would have cases where agriculture value chains have to claim higher emissions than what is happening in reality, because the carbon was sold to organizations outside the chain. And the work we're doing with the Value Change Initiative, over 100 members, is to get value chains organized to keep the carbon in the value chain so that everyone can claim it and co-finances it.
Yeah, maybe I'd just pick on the topic on the last point there, which was around in-setting versus, sales outside the value chain. And so totally in line with what Marion was just talking about. In those markets where there is a capability for us to create value within the value chain, that's exactly what we're doing. The challenge is in markets where there is no inset opportunity, no value to be created inside the value chain. Remembering these are smallholder farmers, and one of the challenges is going to be how we get scaled down to the point where we have a model that works in those. But where that happens, it may be that voluntary carbon markets is the best route in order for us to recognize and reward farmers for the progress they're making. I did want to touch very briefly on the social one. There is a huge risk in there of unintended consequences as we drive in certain markets with some of the transformation that we're only just starting to appreciate. And that is, I mentioned before how many women were leading dairy farms. When the dairy farm gets to a certain scale, the male in the household thinks that he should be running it when it becomes more profitable than maybe his cropping business, etc. And so we're only just starting to come up against trying to work out how do we counter some of those sort of, transitions and unintended consequences. So great question, by the way.
Left my question unanswered, but happy to engage with you on this. As we always worry, food we understand, dairy we want to understand more, so maybe we needed half an hour more here. But anyway, I was supposed to close this with what was the theme. I think I don't have much time for that, which is excellent because I did not prepare for this at all, but because there are too many ideas here. I think one of them, I was going to, there are things here that I didn't even know existed. The kind of coalitions that you guys are talking about, the kind of private sector involvement, the kind of policy level initiatives. And I think I would just like to close with, I don't think, and I think this has been stated, overstated, stale, but I don't think we're collaborating. Collaboration is a bit, we use it all the time. But I really do think people need to talk to each other here. Because I think right on this panel and on everything, we had a policymaker, we had people who work with policymakers, they're So I just think if our takeaway could be, let's just keep talking to each other because we all have solutions. And together, I think it's a much better solution to come out of. I know it's a bit cliched, but that's the theme of this for now. Thank you so much, everyone.